A luxury fashion boutique in Beverly Hills was buzzing with high-end clients. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and designer suits lined the walls. A tall, broad-shouldered man, in a simple black t-shirt and well-worn boots, stepped inside, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. The store's manager, a sharp-dressed man in his early 50s, barely glanced at him before turning his attention to a younger customer, a wealthy businessman draped in an expensive Italian suit. The businessman, sipping his espresso, eyed Keanu's scuffed boots and smirked. "Looks like someone took a wrong turn," he muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. A couple standing nearby chuckled, their laughter blending with the soft, classical music playing in the background. Keanu didn't react. He walked over to a leather jacket and ran his fingers over the fabric, appreciating its craftsmanship. The manager, noticing this, strode over with a forced smile. "Sir, I'm afraid that's a limited edition piece, quite exclusive." His tone made it clear Keanu didn't belong. The businessman, clearly enjoying himself, stepped closer. "You know, I admire confidence," he said, sipping his coffee. "Walking in here with that." He gestured at Keanu's boots, which had seen years of travel, adventure, and life. "It's almost inspiring." His words dripped with sarcasm. "But let's be honest, my friend. This place is for people who understand quality, not for guys who shop at flea markets." Keanu finally looked up, his calm gaze meeting the businessman's amused eyes. There was no anger, no irritation, just quiet observation. He glanced down at his boots, then back up. "They're comfortable," he said simply. The businessman let out a loud laugh. "Comfortable? That's adorable. Tell me, when's the last time you treated yourself? Bought something that actually mattered?" He turned to the manager. "Go on, tell him the price of that jacket." The manager hesitated, but eventually spoke. $25,000. Keanu nodded, considering the jacket for a moment before setting it back. "It's nice." The businessman shook his head, amused. "Man, do you even have that kind of money?" Keanu let out a small chuckle, as if the question itself was amusing. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times. A few seconds later, the store's speakers, connected to the boutique's smart system, suddenly cut off the classical music. Instead, a robotic voice filled the air. "Transaction complete. Keanu Reeves has just acquired this establishment." The laughter stopped. The businessman froze, his smirk vanishing as his gaze darted to the manager, who had turned pale. Keanu slipped his phone back into his pocket, and, for the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Guess I do." The businessman's espresso cup trembled in his hand. "You're joking." Keanu turned to the manager, ignoring him completely. "I think I'll keep the jacket." The store manager's face turned ghostly white as Keanu casually pulled the leather jacket off the hanger and draped it over his arm. The businessman, now visibly unsettled, let out a nervous laugh. This is a joke, right? You can't just walk in and buy an entire store." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. Then, with the same quiet composure, he spoke. "I don't usually respond to arrogance," he said, slipping the jacket on. "But sometimes, people need to be reminded that value isn't measured by price tags." He adjusted the sleeves. "And that humility is free." The businessman gulped, his cocky demeanor rapidly crumbling. "Look, man, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just joking." Keanu's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he turned to the store manager. "What's your name?" The manager hesitated. "J. James." Keanu nodded. "James, you've been working here a long time?" James straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. Yes, sir. 15 years." Keanu tapped the polished checkout counter. "Good. Then you'll understand why things need to change around here." The businessman let out a strained laugh. "All right, fine. You proved your point. Can I just..." Keanu held up a hand, silencing him. You. His voice was still calm, but carried a weight that made the businessman freeze. You judged me by my shoes. He took a step closer, his presence alone making the businessman shrink back. But you never asked where these shoes have been. The businessman swallowed. Whoa, where? Keanu looked down at his boots, the scuffs and worn-out soles holding silent stories. They've walked through refugee camps where children had no shoes at all. His voice remained steady, but a deeper emotion seeped through. They've stood in hospitals, next to sick kids who just wanted someone to talk to. His gaze lifted, piercing and unshakable. They've knelt beside grieving mothers who lost their sons to war. The room was dead silent. The weight of his words pressed down on everyone. Even James, the store manager, lowered his head slightly. Keanu took a step back. You see an old pair of shoes, he continued, but I see memories. I see moments. I see lives that changed mine forever. He turned, walking toward the entrance, but paused just before stepping out. Oh, and James? The manager straightened. Yes, sir. Keanu gestured toward the businessman. People like him? They don't belong in my store. James immediately turned to the businessman. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The businessman's mouth fell open. What? You can't? But the security guards were already moving toward him. Keanu gave a small nod and walked out into the street, his old boots hitting the pavement. The air was crisp, the city humming around him. He smiled to himself, hands slipping back into his pockets. Because while the world was obsessed with appearances, he knew the truth. Real worth was never worn. It was lived. The businessman stumbled backward as the security guards closed in. His confidence had completely vanished. Wait! You can't be serious! This is ridiculous! He turned to James, desperate. I'm a regular here. I spend thousands. James cut him off with a sharp tone. Not anymore. Mr. Reeves made it clear. You don't belong in his store. The businessman's face turned red with humiliation. He turned to the onlookers, the same people who had laughed along with him moments ago, but now they watched in silence, some even shaking their heads. No one was coming to his defense. Realizing he had no way out, he let out an angry huff, grabbed his overpriced espresso from the counter, and stormed toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, his nerves still rattled. He tripped over the entrance mat, and his expensive coffee spilled all over his designer suit. A few gasps echoed through the store. Keanu, now standing outside, had caught the whole thing through the glass window. He shook his head with a small chuckle, then turned away and started walking down the busy Beverly Hills street. He had no interest in revenge, just lessons. As he strolled down the sidewalk, an elderly homeless man sat against a brick wall, his clothes tattered, his shoes practically falling apart. Keanu stopped, glanced down at his own boots, then at the man's. Hey, Keanu said, kneeling down. The old man looked up, surprised. What size do you wear? The man hesitated. 10, I think. Keanu smiled. Perfect. He reached down and began unlacing his own boots. The old man's eyes widened. Whoa, man, you don't gotta do that. Keanu simply shrugged. They've been good to me, but I think they'll be even better for you. Within seconds, Keanu had pulled off his boots and placed them in front of the man. He then reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tucked it into one of the shoes. The man was speechless. I don't know what to say. Keanu patted his shoulder, then stood up barefoot. Just pay it forward when you can. The old man's eyes glistened as he held the worn boots in his hands, realizing they weren't just shoes. They were stories, history, kindness, woven into every scratch and crease. Keanu walked away, his feet touching the cold pavement, but his heart lighter than ever. Meanwhile, back in the boutique, James turned to his employees. still shaken from what had happened. "All right, listen up," he said. "Things are going to be different around here. No more judging customers by their looks. No more arrogance. We treat people with respect, or we don't work here at all." The staff nodded, and for the first time, the store, once built on wealth and status, began to change. And the businessman? He walked out onto the street, coffee-stained and embarrassed, watching Keanu disappear into the distance. He had mocked a man for his shoes, only to realize too late he had never been fit to walk in them. A chilly breeze swept through the city as Keanu walked barefoot along the sidewalk, his mind lost in thought. People passed him, some staring in confusion, others too busy with their own lives to notice. But Keanu didn't care. A few blocks down, he spotted a small diner tucked between towering buildings. The neon sign flickered slightly, giving the place an old-school charm. He pushed the door open, and a tiny bell jingled overhead. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the cold outside. The scent of fresh coffee and pancakes filled the air. A few customers glanced at him. Some recognized him immediately, but hesitated, unsure whether to approach. A waitress in her mid-50s, with tired eyes and a kind smile, made her way over. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm but curious as she glanced at his bare feet. "Rough day?" Keanu chuckled. "Something like that." He slid into a booth by the window. The waitress, whose name tag read Margie, gave him a knowing nod. "Coffee?" "Sounds perfect." As she poured the steaming cup, the front door swung open, and the businessman from the boutique walked in, still fuming. His once perfect suit was stained with coffee, his face twisted in frustration. He didn't seem to notice Keanu at first, as he marched up to the counter. Margie sighed as she approached him. "What can I get you, hun?" The businessman scowled. "Just a coffee, black." Margie nodded and moved to grab the pot, but as she did, her foot caught on the corner of a loose tile. She stumbled, the coffee pot slipping from her grasp. Everything seemed to slow as the dark liquid splashed forward, right onto the businessman's already ruined suit. Gasps rippled through the diner. Margie's face paled. "Oh my, sir, I am so sorry." She grabbed a towel, panicked. I didn't mean to." The businessman shot up from his seat, his face turning beet red. "Are you kidding me? Do you know how much this suit costs? First that store, now this?" His voice rose. "This whole city is filled with incompetence." The diner went silent. All eyes were on him. Keanu, still seated, let out a small sigh. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, then finally spoke. "Maybe the problem isn't the city." The businessman's head snapped toward him. "What?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe the problem is you." A hush fell over the room. The businessman blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Keanu set his coffee down. "You mocked me for my shoes. You laughed at someone you didn't know, assuming your money made you better." He tilted his head. "But now, look around." The businessman hesitated. People in the diner were staring, some shaking their heads in quiet judgment. Keanu continued, his voice steady. "You're the one covered in coffee. You're the one everyone's watching. And the only common factor in all of this is you." The businessman opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Margie, still clutching the towel, looked down, guilt written all over her face. Keanu turned to her and smiled. "It was just an accident, Margie." He glanced at the businessman. "And accidents happen to everyone, right?" The businessman clenched his jaw, but this time he said nothing. Margie swallowed hard. I'll cover your coffee, sir. I'm really sorry." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, placing it on the table. "No need. In fact, let me cover his coffee too." Margie hesitated, then gave a small smile. That's real kind of you, Mr. Reeves. The businessman looked at the bill, then at Keanu. His face burned with shame. Without another word, he grabbed his coffee, turned, and hurried out of the diner, his pride shattered. Keanu took another sip of his coffee, then glanced down at his bare feet. He smirked slightly. Guess I should probably get some new shoes. Margie chuckled. Well, sweetheart, there's a thrift shop right around the corner. They got some nice boots. Keanu grinned. Sounds perfect. And with that, he stood up, stretched, and walked barefoot out into the city. Still Keanu Reeves, still unchanged, but having taught one more lesson to a world that often forgot what truly mattered.